Pandemics have never been merely medical events. They are economic earthquakes that expose the deepest structures of how societies produce, distribute, and protect life. When I look at pandemics through a historical lens, I do not begin with pathogens, but with labor fear and broken routines. Disease does not strike economies evenly. It attacks concentration, dependency, and illusion. Each great pandemic has functioned like an unforgiving audit, revealing which systems were resilient, which were exploitative, and which survived only because normal life had never paused long enough to test them. The Black Death of the 14th century remains the clearest example of how pandemics can reorder economies from the ground up. When perhaps a third to half of Europe's population perished, the immediate effect was collapse, fields, untended trade, frozen towns emptied. Yet from this devastation emerged a radical shift in economic power. Labor became scarce. Land became abundant. For the first time, peasants could demand wages, mobility, and better conditions. Feudal obligations weakened not because of ideology, but because math changed. Lords attempted to impose wage controls and bind workers back to land. But history shows that pandemics do not merely disrupt systems, they accelerate forces already straining against them. The Black Death did not create the end of feudalism, but it made its continuation economically irrational. What is often overlooked is the psychological transformation that followed. Survivors lived with a new relationship to risk and authority. The certainty of death undermined the moral legitimacy of rigid hierarchy. Consumption patterns shifted. Savings increased for some, indulgence for others. Economies did not simply recover, they reoriented. Pandemics compress time. They force changes that would normally unfold over generations into decades or even years. Early modern pandemics repeated this pattern in subtler form. Plagues that swept through 17th century Europe disrupted urban economies, particularly trade hubs like London, Amsterdam, and Venice. Commerce halted not because goods disappeared, but because trust evaporated. Markets depend on proximity, and pandemics criminalize proximity overnight. Quarantines, border controls, and health passes emerged as economic instruments long before they were medical norms. States learned that public health was not separate from fiscal stability. A sick population meant a bankrupt treasury. Here, the idea of the public economy began to form. Governments intervened not only to cure disease, but to preserve commerce. The Industrial Revolution changed the economic impact of pandemics dramatically. Dense cities, factories, and transport networks increased both productivity and vulnerability. Cholera outbreaks in the 19th century revealed how poverty and disease reinforced each other. The working poor lived in conditions that turned illness into inevitability. Pandemics exposed inequality not as moral failure, but as economic design. The response reshaped capitalism itself. Public sanitation, clean water, urban planning, and early welfare measures were not acts of charity. They were investments in labor productivity and social order. Once again, pandemics forced states to confront the cost of neglecting collective goods. The 1918 influenza pandemic arrived at a uniquely fragile moment. The world was already exhausted by war. Supply chains were militarized. Labor markets were distorted. When influenza killed tens of millions, it deepened economic dislocation while remaining strangely under-remembered. Unlike wars, pandemics do not offer victory narratives, yet their economic impact was profound. Labor shortages accelerated mechanization. Women's participation in the workforce expanded. Governments learned that mass mortality could coexist with industrial continuity only through coordination and information control. The pandemic reinforced the idea that economic stability required central authority capable of managing population-scale risk. What ties these historical episodes together is not death toll alone, but structural consequence. Pandemics punish systems built on redundancy-free efficiency. They reward flexibility, surplus, and trust. Economies that rely on just-in-time labor, hyper-concentration, or informal safety nets suffer disproportionately. This lesson echoes across centuries. Pandemics do not destroy capitalism or trade. They expose how narrowly optimized they have become. Modern pandemics operate on a global scale unimaginable to earlier societies. Air travel, integrated finance, and synchronized production transmit shock instantly. Yet the core dynamics remain unchanged. Fear collapses demand. Uncertainty freezes investment. Inequality determines who absorbs pain. The difference is speed. Where past pandemics unfolded over years, modern ones compress shock into months. Policy responses therefore shape outcomes more decisively than ever before. History also reveals a recurring political aftermath. Pandemics expand state capacity. Surveillance, fiscal intervention, and emergency powers become normalized. Some of these powers recede, many do not. The post-pandemic economy is never a simple restoration. It is a renegotiation of responsibility between individuals, markets, and governments. Trust becomes the central currency. Those institutions that preserve legitimacy during crisis emerge stronger. Those that appear indifferent do not recover easily. Perhaps the most enduring economic impact of pandemics lies in memory. Societies that remember pandemics design systems with buffers. Those that forget optimize for efficiency and are shocked again. The rhythm is relentless. Every generation believes itself technologically superior, and every generation rediscovers that biology does not respect balance sheets. And it is precisely here, at the intersection of disease fear and economic structure, that pandemics reveal their deepest historical role, not as interruptions of economic history, but as catalysts that force societies to confront what their economies are actually built to do and for whom. And the story continues as we follow how these shocks reshape inequality, state power, and global integration in ways that outlast the illness itself and push the world toward a new phase of economic reckoning, because the aftermath of pandemics has always mattered more than the moment of contagion itself. Once the immediate fear recedes, societies face choices that determine whether disruption becomes renewal or merely hardened inequality. History shows that pandemics do not automatically produce better economies. They create openings. What follows depends on memory power and political will. After the Black Death, Europe did not instantly become more equal or humane. Elites resisted change fiercely. Wage caps were enforced. Mobility was criminalized. Yet over time, the arithmetic of labor scarcity proved unstoppable. Institutions adapted because they had to. The lesson here is subtle, but critical. Pandemics change constraints, not intentions. They alter what is possible. Whether societies move toward inclusion or repression depends on who controls the response. The same shock can yield emancipation or entrenchment. Or the 19th century public health revolution offers another revealing pattern. Cholera did not persuade governments to invest in sanitation out of compassion for the poor. It did so because disease ignored class boundaries once cities grew dense enough. When elites realized that poverty threatened productivity and their own survival, collective investment followed. Sewers, clean water housing codes, and urban planning transformed economies by raising baseline health and labor efficiency. Growth followed prevention. History reminds us that shared vulnerability is often the only force strong enough to overcome entrenched neglect. The 1918 influenza left a quieter but equally enduring legacy. Its economic consequences were absorbed into post-war reconstruction, masking its independent impact. Yet it reinforced a shift, already underway, the normalization of state responsibility for mass risk. Governments learned that managing economies required managing populations, information, and expectations simultaneously. This lesson would later shape welfare states, public insurance, and crisis intervention doctrines. Pandemics did not invent the modern state, but they accelerated its expansion and legitimized its reach. Modern pandemics intensify these dynamics because globalization magnifies both shock and response. When supply chains fracture, inflation follows. When services halt, inequality widens. Those who can work remotely accumulate security. Those who cannot absorb loss. This stratification is not new, but its visibility is. Pandemics act like contrast agents, making disparities undeniable. History shows that once inequality becomes impossible to ignore, political narratives harden. Either reform follows, or resentment does. Another recurring outcome is the redefinition of efficiency. Before pandemics, economies prize speed, lean inventories, and specialization. After pandemics, resilience gains value. Redundancy, domestic capacity, and strategic stockpiles return to policy agendas. This shift has occurred repeatedly from medieval grain reserves to modern debates about medical supplies and energy security. Over time, however, memory fades. Efficiency reasserts itself. Buffers are cut. The cycle resets. History's warning is clear. Resilience is expensive, but fragility is costlier. Pandemics also reshape globalization's trajectory. They do not end integration, but they complicate it. Trade resumes, capital flows return. Yet trust is altered. Borders harden selectively. Dependencies are reassessed. The world does not retreat into isolation, but it fragments into zones of managed openness. This pattern echoes past transitions after plague war and crisis. Global systems survive by changing form, not by restoring old equilibria. Perhaps the most enduring economic effect of pandemics lies in behavior. Risk perception changes. Households save differently. Firms diversify. States expand fiscal roles once considered exceptional. Some of these changes persist. Others decay. But none are neutral. Pandemics remind societies that the future is uncertain in ways no model can fully capture. That reminder alone reshapes economic decision-making for years. From a long historical view, pandemics are not interruptions of economic history. They are punctuation marks. They end sentences that no longer made sense and force new ones to begin. They expose what was fragile reward, what was adaptable, and punish what confused efficiency with wisdom. Economies that learn from pandemics emerge altered but stronger. Those that rush to forget repeat the same vulnerabilities under new names. If this historical journey through pandemics and economies has deepened your understanding of how shocks shape long-term outcomes, I invite you to subscribe and continue exploring these financial histories with me, and to leave a comment sharing which past pandemic you believe offers the clearest lesson for today. Because history shows that disease fades, but the economic choices made in its shadow define societies far longer than the illness itself